5 years after the Great Recession, the major indicators suggest that the economy is booming again, and corporate profits are abundant. But for 99% of people, it doesn't feel that way. According to economist William Lazonick, a major reason is stock buybacks, a technique companies use to finesse their stock price and increase the value of stock options. This is the story of how they came to dominate what companies do with their cash, and why they foster inequality and stifle innovation and growth. For 3 decades after World War II, most U.S. workers shared in post-war growth and prosperity. Companies retained their workers, paid them well, and reinvested their earnings in strengthening their capabilities. Real wages and productivity gains marched upward in lockstep, expanding the middle class. But in the 1970s, things got out of sync. Wages started to lag, even though workers continued to help generate sturdy productivity gains. And during the next 3 decades, workers shared less and less in the resulting financial rewards of corporate growth. So companies continued to generate more profits, but were sharing less of it with workers. What did they do with all of that cash? When companies have cash on hand, they can do 3 things with it. First, they can reinvest it, expand their employees' skills, increase their pay and benefits, hire more people, create new products and services, and make capital investments that make their companies more competitive. Second, they can pay out cash dividends to shareholders, who can put that money back into the economy, reinvest in other companies and new ventures, and help keep the economy humming to a point. Third, a company can repurchase its own shares. That's a stock buyback. This reduces the number of company shares on the market, automatically increasing the company's earnings per share, or EPS, a key metric that Wall Street expects CEOs to hit each quarter. In general, experts will tell you that the first activity, reinvesting in your people and your company, is the most important way to spend company cash in order to remain competitive and find growth opportunities. But for the past 3 decades, major corporations have increasingly focused on the second and third activities, dividends and buybacks. In the early 80s, stock buybacks were negligible, but the cash spent on dividends hit 50% of net income, prompting concerns that such a high payout ratio was impeding investment in productive capabilities. By the late 80s, buybacks had also taken hold. Buybacks and dividends combined accounted for, on average, a whopping 80% of net income. That left precious little cash to put back into the business or into employees' pockets in the form of higher wages. Beginning in the late 90s, the amount spent on buybacks has surpassed the amount spent on dividends in many years. During the 2000s, the 449 companies listed on the S&P 500 between 2003 and 2012 spent 54% of their earnings, $2.4 trillion, on buybacks. Another 37% went to dividends. That left 9% of earnings available for productive reinvestment. In some cases, at the height of buyback mania, companies spent more than 100% of earnings on buybacks, meaning they were dipping into reserves or borrowing to do stock buybacks. Meanwhile, as companies use less and less of their money for productive reinvestment or wages, they're asking the public to use more and more of its money for the same. William Lazonick, author of the HBR article Profits Without Prosperity, explains that in nanotechnology, for example, industry leaders have pleaded for publicly funded research, arguing that the United States can't remain competitive without it. Lobbying yielded the taxpayer-funded National Nanotechnology Initiative, which spends about $1.5 billion per year.
Intel alone has spent 4 times that amount just buying back its own stock. So the question I ask is, why isn't a company like Intel, if it says this is what we need and this needs to be a collaboration, stepping forward with even a fraction of that and taking a leadership position and saying, we're putting this money in, everybody else should put this money into this national research project before or as they go ask the government to do it.
This is why most Americans aren't feeling the recovery. The obvious question it raises is, how are companies getting away with this? Executives give 3 main justifications for buybacks. 1, their company's shares are undervalued. In other words, the share price is lower than what its leaders think the price should be given their firm's prospects. Buying back stock increases EPS and raises the share price to match what leaders think the value should be.
And in fact, what we know overwhelmingly from the evidence is that companies buy stock prices, buy back their stock when prices are high, not when prices are low.
2. Buybacks offset the dilutions of earnings per share that happens when employees are granted stock options. But Lazonick's research shows that the volume of buybacks far outstrips the options granted. Also, buybacks belie the point of granting options in the first place, which is to motivate people to work hard to increase the value of the company.
Basically, what they're doing is saying that process of paying workers was not successful in generating the earnings that led to higher stock prices, so we have to do it through the manipulation of the stock price. And basically, that's what's going on. So either they should get rid of that so-called incentive payment through stock options, or they should stop doing the buybacks.
3. Buybacks return unneeded cash to shareholders at companies with limited investment options because they are mature companies. Lazonick believes that this failure to find opportunities worthy of investment is a failure of corporate leadership.
If that's the attitude of the executives of major companies that have built up capabilities over decades and are the only ones in the U.S. economy that can invest for the future in their fields, then we have a problem and they have a problem. They're not really doing their jobs in running these companies by thinking about the future.
So, if the reasons executives give aren't the real justifications for buybacks, what are? Lazonick cites 2 rather prosaic explanations. 1, it's a way to manipulate the stock price for the short term, goosing the price to please investors. And 2, it's a way to increase pay for the top executives. It's true that a huge proportion of executive compensation is in the form of their company's stock. In 2012, the 500 highest-paid executives of U.S. public companies received, on average, about $30 million. 42% of that compensation came from stock options, and 41% from stock awards. The 10 companies that bought back the most stock from 2003 to 2012 spent 68% of their combined net income, almost $900 billion. Their CEOs received, on average, $168 million each, 58% of which was in the form of stock options and awards. Despite these buybacks, only 3 of these 10 companies, ExxonMobil, IBM, and Procter & Gamble, outperformed the S&P 500 index in that time. William Lazonick believes that if companies won't voluntarily change course and shift spending back to reinvestment in wages, they must be made to do so, with 4 solutions. 1. Ban buybacks. This should include rescinding rules passed by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission during the Reagan years that give companies substantial freedom to buy back their shares and manipulate the stock market. 2. Change executive incentives to encourage value creation, not value extraction. Specifically, change regulations in order to rein in stock-based executive pay. 3. Change corporate boards from including only CEOs and other executives to include more stakeholders, especially workers and taxpayers. 4. Fix the tax regime, which focuses on tax breaks as incentives. Instead of giving established corporations lower tax rates, the government should make them pay higher taxes in order to fund investments in the infrastructure and knowledge base needed to generate more innovation in the United States. For a fuller explanation of these solutions, read Lazonick's article, Profits Without Prosperity, in the September 2014 issue of the Harvard Business Review. Given the importance of corporations and the stock market to the U.S. economy, the government must step in to check the behavior of those who are unable or unwilling to control themselves. It must help us recreate a society where many, many more share in the growth and prosperity of the U.S. economy, where work and wages march upward in lockstep.